So I'm just going to share the screen so you can see the slides. Okay. Before I start, I want to thank Lynn Verge for inviting me to speak, Argo Bookstore for bringing the books, and Jason and Dawn for help with the technical setup. I wrote Their Benevolent Design, Conservative Women and Protestant Child Charities in Montreal, to highlight the major contribution upper middle class women made to Montreal and to the city's early system of social services. The book uses the two oldest Protestant child charities, the Montreal Protestant Orphans Asylum and the Montreal Ladies Benevolent Society, as an example of female benevolence. I will refer to them as POA and LBS from now on. Formed in 1822 and 1832, respectively, the two associations joined together in 1946 and subsequently became Summerhill Homes. Today, Batshaw holds their papers. When Lynn asked me to speak about my book right before Mother's Day, I thought the timing couldn't be better. After all, my presentation is about women, most of whom were mothers, helping needy women and children. And in the 19th century, with its changing economy and no social welfare system, many families were desperately in need of help. Over the 19th century, the combined forces, of urbanization, immigration, that's not good, okay, and industrialization saw a tenfold increase in Montreal's population. The fragility of the wage market meant that large numbers of people lived under the constant threat of unemployment, underemployment, destitution, homelessness, and hunger. Since much of this unemployment occurred during the winter slowdown, it was concurrent with increased fuel and clothing costs, making it even more devastating. For most low-wage workers, and certainly for recent immigrants, poverty was a way of life. Images in the illustrated press by the 1870s highlighted this misery. A winter scene by Auguste Trichon appeared in L'Opinion Publique in 1875. The article that accompanied it described the misery that many poor families, especially during the winter. The society ladies we see at the door are charity visitors. One can only hope that they are bringing more than just advice. This image of dead children in their lodgings, called Frozen to Death, was on the front page of Canadian Illustrated News in 1872. Without a public poor relief system, poor relief was left to the private sector. The state provided only nominal financial support. In Montreal, social services developed along confessional lines with separate networks, one run by the Catholic Church, staffed mainly by nuns, and one formed by Montreal's Protestant elite. It is this second network that interests us here today. The choices the Protestant elite made as to the types of services they would provide and their admission criteria determined what aid was available for Protestant families and who had access to it. Increasingly influenced by liberalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and personal responsibility, as well as the association of poverty with moral weakness and even crime, the male members of the Protestant community were hesitant to establish a relief structure that might encourage dependency or laziness. And a permanent house was not established until 1863. This constrained benevolence on the part of the elite left the city's Protestant poor with limited access to assistance, and explains why the child charities, organized by women, were so central to family survival as a result. McGill-Queen's University Press used this image by W.M. Ridley, called The Parlor and the Pavement, as the book's cover. It appeared in L'Opinion Publique in 1876 and depicts an abandoned mother and child, now homeless, taking momentary refuge on the steps of the home of a well-to-do family. As members of the city elite, the people under the bright parlor lights had a lot more control over the aid available than did the poor destitute woman desperately trying to shelter her child. Despite the sympathy the image elicits, the article that accompanies it in the newspaper goes on to surmise that alcohol was more than likely the main culprit in the situation, a view that parroted liberal ideas about poverty being the fault of the poor themselves. It was elite women who responded first to social inequality in the city, and they continued to do so throughout the century, both founding and running almost all of the services and institutions for women and children. The first such effort was the Female Benevolent Society, formed in 1815 after a 10-month subscription campaign to raise the funds. At the opening meeting, the women formed the association and rented a building in which to provide education, shelter, and medical care for recent immigrants and needy city families. Here we see a drawing of their house on Lewis Street. Circumstances led to the FBS closing its doors in 1822, since some of the services were now available from others, including the newly formed Montreal General Hospital. Some of the members of the committee then formed the Protestant Orphans Asylum to take in the children. The Ladies' Benevolent Society was created 10 years later in 1832 in the wake of widespread need resulting from the cholera epidemic in that year. It would admit both children and women. The POA home was built in 1849 on 2 lots on St. Catherine between Stanley and Drummond. A third lot was later added as a playground and a garden. This image is of the home in 1875. In 1893, the POA built a larger home on Summerhill and Côte de Neige. Once the LBS was formed in 1832, the POA accepted only full orphans, that's children bereft of both parents, although others were accepted in a few exceptional cases. It helped about 1,200 children between the ages of 2 and 12 from 1822 to 1921, but was a relatively small institution. On average, over the course of a year, 42 children were in the institution, but only 33 at any given time. Many of the children, being orphans, remained for years. The LBS built their home on Ontario Street between Bleury and City Councillor in 1856. This sketch depicts the house in 1920, when several additions had been made to ease overcrowding. Over the 19th century, the LBS acted as a sort of poorhouse for women and children, admitting elderly women, destitute younger women, female convalescents, but its main work was with children. Between 1832 and 1921, 3,700 children were admitted. Accordingly, the LBS was much bigger than the POA. Once it moved into its permanent home on Ontario Street, the average number of children present at any one time from 1856 to 1900 was 98, with an average of 154 over the year. As we can see from these numbers, turnover was high. 50% of children remained less than a year, and a great many of them only for a few months, as parents placed their children temporarily during a family crisis and then removed them. As I mentioned, the LBS also admitted elderly women, some of whom remained for many years. This is a photo of a few of them in 1909. They helped with chores like knitting, if possible, but many were bedridden, which demanded a great deal of specialized care. When I refer to the women who ran the 2 charities and their benevolence as conservative in the book's title, I am adopting the definition used by several American historians. In their study of women's activism, they distinguish between associations of conservative, benevolent women and those that used a reform approach. In this context, conservative refers to a worldview based on hierarchical social order, the central importance of tradition, social status, and religion, as well as the duty of the privileged to help the poor, what we usually call a needs-based response to poverty. These women hope to alleviate poverty and the problems it posed for families, not to reform the poor or to try to eradicate poverty itself, as some groups formed later in the century hoped to do. Their direct approach to providing aid and this more conservative worldview were two of the ways the women distinguished themselves from the male elite, and which enabled them to moderate some of liberalism's restrictive and moralist notions in relation to the provision of relief, at least in terms of women and children. Although the ladies themselves often cast moral aspersions on poor families, and class certainly was a central feature in their charity work. So who were these charity women? Over the 19th century, 589 women, or ladies, as they preferred to call themselves, served on either the POA or the LBS committee. As members of the city's Protestant bourgeoisie, they came from families of merchants, manufacturers, doctors, lawyers, judges, even mayors. Many of them were linked by family connections. There was almost always a representative of the Ross, McCord, Tiley families, the coarse, savage Lymans, the Muffets, the Greenshields, and the Armour Ramsays in the POA, of the Richardsons, the Greenshields, the Mackenzies, the Ogdens, and the Evans in the LBS. The various Torrance and Molson families were well represented on both committees. Mothers and daughters, sisters and sisters-in-law worked in the same bonds of kin, friendship, and sisterhood that historians have found in other cities, either working together on the committees or following each other in the family example. Before we look at their work, policy development, and the factors that influence these, let's take a moment to meet a few of the women who were among the leaders and the most dedicated members. Here we see Jane Davidson Ross. Her daughter, Mary Jane Ross Tiley, and Anne Ross McCord, and her granddaughter, Anne McCord. This group of linked family members worked for many years on the POA committee, holding executive positions as first directress, treasurer, or secretary for much of the 19th century. They rarely sat on the committee as simple committee members. In a similar way, the sisters Fanny and Jane Evans consecutively held the job of secretary for the LBS from 1856 to 1892. Eliza Ross, another one of Jane Ross's daughters, and Louisa Goddard Frothingham were two of the single women who were very active and long-term members of the POA committee. Louisa spearheaded several reforms to make decision-making more democratic, and Eliza was a member of both committees. Mary Corse Lyman was also a very active long-term member of both committees. Harriet Wheeler initiated several major reforms when she was first directress of the LBS. And Elizabeth Greenshields, seen here with her daughters, was also an active member and a directress. The majority of committee members were married, although a few single women, including Louisa Frothingham and Eliza Ross, who we just met, worked tirelessly for these committees. Some of these women, like Louisa, married during their terms of service. She would marry J.H.R. Molson, the Molson who owned the brewery, but remained on the committee for another 20 years. Many women worked on these boards for extensive periods of time, often until their death. Some of their husbands died during their tenure, and they continued on as widows. Serving on a charity board was an accepted, even expected activity for ladies of the elite. And since charities were an integral part of the institutional structures that underpin class relations, membership reinforced a family's social importance and their moral authority in the city. In many ways, this was a sociable activity, as women worked alongside friends, relatives, and neighbors. But charity management also required a great deal of challenging administrative tasks and serious responsibilities. Committees needed to develop policies on admissions, departure, internal conditions, create a budget and raise the necessary funds, hire staff, visit the institutions to ensure adequate conditions and care of the residents, and deal with families or parents, placement families, and officials like city inspectors. We noted that many women were members of these committees, but can we assume that they all were involved in the actual work and developed administrative skills as a result? My analysis found that work was not evenly spread among members. The majority were members for less than 5 years, rarely attended meetings, never supervised the institution as a monthly visitor, and did not participate in fundraising. They basically were silent or token members. Their membership possibly a question of social obligation or family pressure. That left the bulk of the work and much of the decision-making, which happened at the meetings, to a small core of talented and dedicated members who invested a substantial amount of time and effort. This group, of course, included the 11 women we already met. They were assisted by another group, some of whom made a particular contribution in one area, such as fundraising or visiting. This lack of overall involvement made it more difficult to supervise the institutions and their schools, and to organize fundraising events than it otherwise would have been, and left real power in the hands of a few families for much of the century. As private incorporated societies, the main financing for both societies came from the annual subscriptions paid by their members. This was one way that women in the elite could support the charities, even if they weren't in a position to give of their time. Other income included small government grants, board in the case of the LBS, and entertainment income from bazaars, and then collections. A lack of volunteers to raise these funds in the LBS, which had much larger needs, meant that finances were extremely tight, with deficits in several years. Both societies formed endowment funds by mid-century, and these grew slowly, providing interest income by 1890. Although many of the members left small bequests in their wills, only a few of the women were in a position to use their own personal wealth to help the charities. One of these was Louisa Frothingham Molson, who had access to both the Frothingham and the Molson wealth. Another was Agnes Budden E.H. King, who we see here. Both Agnes and her husband made substantial donations to the LBS in the early 20th century, $50,000 to be precise, quite a lot of money at the time. Class was an ever-present feature of charitable work. Charity was, of course, seen as a gift, not a right. Committee members always referred to themselves as ladies, often with a capital L. This language united the upper middle class ladies who managed the charities, but it distinguished between them and the women who helped or who worked for them in their charity. Ladies also used charity work as a way to initiate children or family members into the role as ladies of the elite. Daughters, nieces, granddaughters followed on in the tradition or worked alongside their mothers. Younger children often attended the institution's Christmas dinner with their mothers, or their school class might send special donations for the charity children. Finally, although they agreed to help needy families by admitting children, caring for them, and educating them, not surprisingly, the committee ladies tended to understand childcare from the perspective and values of their own class. This perspective could, on occasion, diverge from the aim of parents. When we look at the apparatus of social assistance, it's important to remember that institutions like charities were an integral part of the framework that structured social relations and that championed what the elite considered appropriate norms and social order. The relationship between a charity director and a poor family applying for admission was one in which the elite management committee had substantially more power than working class applicants. But it was also a complex interactive dynamic, and working class agency was an important factor in the process. Placing children in a charity was one strategy families used to cope with familial difficulties or financial problems. Requesting this aid was, in itself, a form of agency. Families needed to decide where their application was most likely to meet with success, and then find the best way to present their situation to ensure this acceptance. I found that in the case of the LBS, the institution that dealt with a lot of families, obviously, this could mean presenting themselves as members of the predominant Anglican Church or as one-parent families. Or it might even involve mothers entering the institution as workers to ensure that their children could remain as boarders when the mother herself left. The main form of agency families and relatives demonstrated, however, was requesting the discharge of children as soon as possible, despite rules on minimal one-year residence, which both charities had. In this context, on the rare occasion that committees refused to release children, families demonstrated clear agency, stealing their children from the charity home, or even challenging the charities in the courts. Thus, working-class families were much more assertive than their position of relative powerlessness suggests. Class and gender intersect in the ladies' charitable work and their response to poverty, but gender was the determinant factor. Their place as women in a highly gendered society where women did not have the same rights as men impacted on the work of these female charities or committees. The dominant gender ideology at the time was premised on the belief in gender-specific qualities and in separate spheres of action, the public sphere for men, the private sphere for women. Although influential, this ideology was only a constructed discourse. In actuality, any such boundaries were flexible, and charity management effectively existed in the social sphere, in a sense, between the spheres, where it was accepted despite the public nature of much of the work it involved. But while abstract and nuanced, these gendered notions could still be very powerful if women internalized them, like the Montreal ladies did. In fact, notions of special qualities and social conventions of polite society affected what these ladies believed about their position as women and what those around them expected of them. It must be remembered that charity managers acceded to their power by virtue of their class status and exercised it with the support of the male establishment. Following prevailing gendered prescriptions was important to maintain this support, as well as their social credibility as elite women or ladies. Therefore, certainly in their public posture, the women on these charity committees defined themselves in the limiting terms of the ideology of separate spheres, carefully respected social conventions in terms of propriety, and the restrictions placed on women's intervention in public space, such as not speaking in a public meeting, including their own annual meetings where they weren't allowed to talk. Moreover, they tended to downplay the administrative aspects of their work, referring to this as simply quiet usefulness. Finally, out of respect for notions of gender-defined special qualities, in the last half of the 19th century, once they started to build buildings, they allocated male activities like investments and building construction to men's committees that were formed specifically to assume these responsibilities. Yet, these same gendered notions empowered the ladies when it came to policy decisions in terms of children and managing the institutional home, both seen as domestic by nature and based on women's moral and religious authority, hence within the woman's sphere of competence. This gave them the confidence to persevere in the face of financial difficulties and to base their policies on years of experience, not on new trends, even if some supporters questioned this. Still, the ladies' gender did bring with it some limitations that impacted on their work. As women, they did not have the same freedom as men to travel, to rescue children in abusive situations, for example, and the reluctance to publicly prosecute apprenticeship masters in cases of abuse, even sexual abuse, was influenced by the same gender considerations. Gender is also important in explaining the supportive women's culture that developed inside these charity committees and that influenced their protective, personal approach to charity work, based on what Veronica Strong-Boak calls a highly gendered ethic of care, as well as their pro-child, and to some extent at least, pro-family perspective. The ladies worked together on female committees made up of close networks of kinship and friendship. They brought with them a shared women's culture and value system based on humanism and religious dedication. Their approach to charity was centered on their particular project or institution and the needs of the residents, what I have referred to as a person-centered approach. This kept them focused and pragmatic. All of these factors, class power, their conservative benevolent approach, and their gendered beliefs, converge to influence the ladies, their benevolent design, and policy development. So we'll speak a few minutes about policy. The ladies believed that the children would benefit from a home-like environment designed to provide them with education, moral training, and skills that they would need in the future. However, despite their desire to create a real home, institutional life was highly regimented and routine. Part of this was necessary to maintain order in an institution with a large number of children. Part of it was driven by the determination to instill regular, wholesome habits and middle-class values. Children followed a daily schedule of prayers, meals, school, and work, a routine that was rigorous and unchanging except for Sundays and holidays. Began at 6 in the morning, and the children went to bed at 8 at night. The institution's schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography. Like children in working-class families and other child charities, the children helped with housekeeping and meal preparation, made some of the clothing, and did other sundry chores like chopping wood and gardening. But hired staff did the major work, cooking, laundry, and cleaning. Some of this work, though, was specifically designed to teach gender roles. Budget constraints often compromised conditions and led to what we could describe as parsimonious policies. The ladies were also occasionally hampered by their concern about appearing overly extravagant with subscribers' donations and their beliefs about what was minimally necessary for charity children. Committee members donated maps, books, and even furniture, but in the early years, even the POA, which had smaller budget needs, it was not unusual for children to stand either while they ate or while they went to school because of a lack of chairs and desks. The same budget constraints overshadowed debates concerning the need for luxuries like whole milk and butter in the children's diets, which as a result had an overabundance of carbohydrates. Likewise, outdoor exercise, even walks, was hampered by a lack of clothing. In the LBS, children needed to attend church in several groups since they had to share the same coats. The fear of disease and the attempt to protect children from outside contamination led to policies that restricted parental visits and admissions during epidemics in the city. Nonetheless, close monitoring by the institution's doctors and rapid vaccination on admission kept deaths to a minimum. Despite these problems, the ladies were determined to make their institutions into homes. They did this by attempting to create what could be described as fictive families. Everyone ate together in the dining room. Everyone attended daily family prayers together twice a day, and elaborate family celebrations were held at Christmas with donations from the public. The LBS held their Christmas tree celebrations inside the institution, but the POA held theirs at the home of Louisa Frothingham, seen here on Desrochers and Pine Avenue. By the end of the century, the summer was filled with picnics and other family outings. Policy changes were influenced by several factors, and in the process, Montreal ladies demonstrated a remarkable level of professionalism for volunteer committees. An increased recognition of the need for child protection led to the modification of internal policies on health, diet, and schooling, and generally improved conditions. The demand for new services in the city led to new and adjusted admissions policies. The POA opened a separate annex to admit orphan children during the epidemic of 1848 and opened a convalescent home for women and children inside their new building in 1910. Although designed for children from destitute one-parent families, the LBS gradually accepted more children from two-parent families as well as those with working families, and was certified as an industrial school in 1883. This latter type of institution was meant for children who were thought to be at risk of imminent delinquency, but the LBS treated them all like all the other children, believing that all the children inside the institution were endangered to some extent. Most children leaving the institutions returned to their parents. Those for whom this was impossible, like the orphans, were placed as apprentices in families, although a few were adopted. You've got to remember, though, that adoption was not legal in Quebec until 1924, so this would have been quasi-legal adoption. Changes were made to placement policies to provide more protection and better supervision for these children. Adoption rules were tightened and limited to childless families. While apprenticeship age was increased to 12 or 14, the fees were increased and trial periods were introduced. The POA developed a sophisticated visiting system, which was quite unusual for a child charity, that was also used for pre-inspection. Nonetheless, problems existed, and even some serious cases of abuse occurred. Exit policies were adjusted in light of these problems. The POA removed adoption completely from their charter in 1855, after the death of a 5-year-old little girl who had been adopted. The years of using apprenticeship and dealing with contractual violations and even physical and sexual abuse helped the committees gain experience and build a base of expertise. Although they believed socialization in a family was important, they believed adequate training and protection were even more so. As a result, recognizing that placement families could not always be trusted, they decreased the use of apprenticeship. By the 1880s, both committees introduced a policy of prolonged institutionalization, at least for girls, who trained inside the charity as upper servants and left to go directly into service at the age of 17. The POA used this policy for a few boys, but some boys were still apprenticed by both committees. I have qualified the charities as being basically protective. But what of the experience of the children who found themselves living in these institutions? In trying to evaluate this, I have taken insight from various concepts used by historians of childhood, as well as recent studies on 20th century institutions based on interviews. Teaching the children appropriate values like obedience, cleanliness, and order was clearly a priority for the charity managers, who tended to believe that since this had not been done properly by the children's families, the children needed to be re-educated. In fact, probably almost everything was different from what the children were accustomed to. Even the size of the 3-story buildings. The dangers of the city street were gone, but so was the sound of running feet and spontaneous laughter. This might have made the situation somewhat traumatic for children. If we juxtapose this Notman photo of houses for Mr. Meredith, of houses in poor districts from which some of the children might have come, with this 1909 photo of the LBS building, one can understand how children might have been intimidated by the physical differences. Neither committee built in any period of adjustment when the children arrived, to recognize that they had just lost or been separated from their families and were now faced with a new routine of school and work. The rules were explained to them, and once they were dressed in institution clothes and checked by the doctor, they joined the other children immediately. It is possible that the matron, or maybe the teacher, smoothed over this transition, but no official policies were noted. Moreover, children were separated by age, so those with younger siblings would only see them during meals. This must have been particularly difficult for children who were accustomed to looking after their younger brothers and sisters. In this way, differences in class norms and even material factors such as the size of the buildings and the internal routine could result in children experiencing the shift from family home to institutional home, as what historians Stephanie Olson, Karen Valgarda, and Christine Alexander refer to as an emotional frontier or a class of culture. Finally, aspects of institutional life, including things like uniforms, routine, and isolation, created a similarity and hopefully built a bond between the children inside the institution, but also highlighted ways in which they were different from children outside it. This was particularly true when they were marched 2 by 2 in a row on their way to church or Sunday school in their special Sunday uniforms. Some children found this situation emotionally difficult, and many ran away. Others found some security in this structured life, especially if they had come from a turbulent family beforehand, and they found it hard to leave the institutional home when they were being apprenticed, for instance. Most of the children in the LBS didn't need to worry too much, as they knew they would be returning to their families within a short period of time. Those in the POA who tended to stay many more years lived in a smaller institution where it was probably a bit easier to create a fictive family unit. This photo of the LBS children in the institution's backyard gives an inkling of why the children might have felt different than others they met on the street or their former playmates. Hence, here we see them lined up with their hair cut short for easy maintenance, all dressed in their Sunday uniforms, all looking quite similar. By the end of the century, their shifting policies put the committees in direct conflict with two movements in childcare and philanthropy in general. Foster care, or placing out as it was called in the 19th century, advocated placing children in families without a contract like apprenticeship had. Although advocates claimed it was a new, more modern method, the committees rejected it on the basis of their years of experience using apprenticeship and adoption, often with negative results. Quite simply, they found it too dangerous. If apprenticeship's legal contract had not always protected children, the lack of a contract was surely simply foolhardy. So-called scientific charity called for a more systematic philanthropy aimed at coordinating relief in a city to reduce dependency, and to increase self-reliance among the poor. The ladies rejected its underlying premise as too restrictive. They were determined both to maintain services for families and to defend, of course, their institutional autonomy. In the process, they met with criticism from some among the male elite and pressure to change their policies. The ladies did not bend to this pressure, maintaining their policy independence. This also highlighted the ways in which these benevolent women differed from women involved in social reform, like the Local Council of Women or the YWCA, for example, both of whom supported foster care and scientific charity as new methods. These conflicts would become even more evident in the 20th century. The Montreal Charities were an important component of the city's social regulation structure, and the managers were influenced, to some extent at least, by the larger liberal perspective. Nonetheless, countervailing ideologies of religious motivation, humanitarianism, and traditional class obligations, as well as their maternal and caring approach to work with children and the expertise they developed from years of doing this, all contributed to their benevolent design. Overall, we could characterize their approach as both realistic, as they provided aid when it was needed, and optimistic, as they carried out their religious duty to save souls and their class duty to train children, hoping that they had improved the children's lives, at least while they were in the institutions, and that possibly their efforts would have some impact on the children in the future. Contemporaries often criticize benevolent societies such as these two for being amateurish and sentimental and resistant to change. But I hope that I have showed that this was not a fair evaluation of these two Montreal societies and the strong women who managed them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice. That's important information and quite sobering. And the pictures really added a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm guessing there will be questions. For anyone here with me in person, thanks. I'll be right with you. You have to speak into the mic for the Zoom audience to hear, so I'm coming right to you. And I'll ask the staff to alert me to any questions in the Zoom chat. Here you go.
May I ask why you only focused on the Protestant elite? There were very many more other benevolent societies.
Well, it was the topic that I chose to do. There's lots of studies done on the Catholic Charities, but the Protestant network, there is basically no study about it at all. So I started to work on these charities. These particular two charities have extensive archives that are in Batshaw. So I was able to look at the annual reports, minutes of meetings. They even had matrons' journals that would tell daily what was happening. That's how I knew who was visiting or who wasn't visiting among the committee members. And then, of course, all the registers, right? There were other Protestant child charities as well. That Harvey Institute, which used to be called the Home and School of Industry, was mainly a school to train girls as their servants. But they admitted some of the girls' little brothers if the family had, just to keep the family together. And then by 1871, maybe you remembered how I mentioned how the charities took in children from 2 to 12. They occasionally admitted 14-year-old girls to try to train them a bit, but never 14-year-old boys. So in 1871, there was no care for infants in Protestant society, so they were all given to the nuns. In 1871, the Protestant Infants' Home was finally founded, and an institution for adolescent boys, the Montreal Boys' Home. The day nursery, finally, to help working parents without institutionalizing the children, was also founded later in the century. So there were various other institutions, but I focused on these two because of the ability to have all their archives.
Okay, there's a Zoom question from Jen. Do you know how Batshaw has revised earlier policies?
Pardon? Do I know how Batshaw?
Okay, the question on the Zoom chat from Jen is, do you know how Batshaw has revised earlier policies?
No. No. Well, no. Batshaw basically holds these papers that I've been working on. I don't work on current family placement or any of those things.
Okay, in the audience, Sam Allison.
Yeah, very, very good talk. I have two perhaps unfair questions. Number one, the British sent over at least 30,000 orphans and little children to Quebec. Did any of them end up in the Montreal institution? And secondly, you seem to deal only with urban children. Did you take any children from rural areas and send children back to rural areas?
Janice, could you hear the first question? Sam, would you repeat the first question, but more slowly, please?
Yes, okay. The British charitable groups in Britain sent over at least 30,000 orphan children to Quebec. My question to you is, did any of them end up in the Montreal institution you deal with?
Okay.
And secondly...
Maybe one at a time.
Okay.
Okay. So the British home children, well, Sam is asking about.
Almost all, quite a large number, certainly a majority of children in the institutions were from the British Isles. Not many of them had just arrived. Some of them, it says in the place, did. A lot of those children, though, were sent through immigration societies, right? And then a lot of those societies had their own reception homes. So, for instance, the Miss McPherson's home in Knowlton, some of the boys from that home would then end up in Montreal, and they went into the boys' home. And the founders, or the people who ran the boys' home, they were very concerned about this. They literally went to England to meet with the societies, to ask them to please send the boys directly to them in the city, rather than have the children live in a farm for a while and then find, no, they can't stand farm life, and end up homeless again in a city. But the societies refused to do that.
Sam, your second question.
Yes, did they take any children from rural Quebec, from the eastern townships, or was it almost entirely urban children from the Montreal area?
Yes, the Protestant Orphan Asylum often, or always, but at the Synod, they would advertise that they were willing to take in children from the countryside, for sure. So they did do this. The LBS, on the other hand, used a policy of 2-year residence. So you had to have been in the city for a while. So even though a large majority of their children are listed as not Canadians or Montrealers, they were foreign born, let's say, they probably weren't recent immigrants. So they had tried to make it in the city until they finally could get their children put in.
From the Zoom chat, Karen Clark asked, do you have a favorite story from all of your research? A favorite story, Janice?
Well, yeah, maybe. The charities were very religious, okay? And if you can imagine, in a society like Montreal, where the Protestant population was always in a minority. Anglophones were in a majority in the middle of the century, but not at the beginning and not at the end. Okay, so there's this tiny little period where they were. But as Protestants, they always were in a minority. So their rules about allowing religion to control, they would never admit a Catholic child because they were so afraid of proselyticism from the other side. Unlike a city like Boston or Toronto, where charities deliberately went and took Catholic children and brought them into Protestant charities, right, to try to proselytize them. This never happened in Montreal. And even if a child, they found after the fact, a child had even one Catholic parent, they would dismiss them. One of the most interesting stories is of a family with about 5 children who were in the charity. And they had been in the charity 3 times. 2 times because the parents were, let's say, fond of alcohol and fairly violent. So on 2 occasions, the father had brought the children to the charity, the LBS, because the mother was in jail for violent drunkenness. On the 3rd occasion, the father and the mother having a little drinking spree, the father was beating the mother, and then she ended up in the hospital and he ended up dead. Okay. The children, of course, are brought to the institution. A few months later, the mother tries to get them out, but the father has made sure that all the children are baptized Protestant. The second time they had been in, he had taken the 3 youngest ones to Reverend Bond to get them baptized, and the 2 oldest ones were already baptized. The ladies have the baptism certificates. There is no way they're letting these children go to a Catholic mother who wants to put them in St. Patrick's, the Catholic institution for children. The mother will come and have the children climb over the wall. The nuns have cabs waiting for the children. They whisk them off to St. Pat's. Okay? Now, what is the ladies going to do? Well, of course, then what happens is they encourage someone to become the tutor of the children. The tutor uses habeas corpus to take the children out of St. Pat's, bring them to the orphanage. So there's this whole, then the nuns insist that the ladies give back the clothes that the nuns had, and the LBS insists that the nuns bring back the other clothes. So there's this whole long process that occurs with these children. So it's a very tragic story, really, but quite interesting.